I think I'm going to start the session now. So everyone, welcome to this session on considering ESG related risks and opportunities into the employer covenant process. And this is part of the London Climate Action Week's activities. So welcome to this session. As was mentioned in the pre-session emails or information that you would have received, we are recording this session with the intention to include the presentation elements of this session online for future participants. So my name is Kerry Perkins. I head up capital markets at Accounting for Sustainability, also called A4S. What we will be doing today is talking through the elements of how and why you can embed ESG into the employee covenant process. And I'm delighted to be joined by Karina Brooks, who is chair of the Employee Covenant Practitioners Association, and Paul Burnett from Railpen, who heads up their employee covenant team. So firstly, just to talk a little bit about this, why we put this session together. Obviously, assessing the strength of the employer's covenant is part of an integrated approach to risk management, and requiring trustees to consider how the employer's ability to address a range of likely future scenarios will have a financial impact. And these scenarios, either downside or upside, can include the impact of climate change, biodiversity threats, inequality, and other challenges that, as I said, may affect the financial ability of the sponsor to support the scheme, both today as well as in the future. So looking at this in more detail, I should note that even though that this process, the employee covenant process, is very specific to the UK market, the UK DB market, the practical actions and top tips that we talk about today will be relevant for global asset owners who need to consider as sponsoring employers' future resilience. And also we have launched this morning guidance on this topic, as well as a case study from Railpen to really kind of deep dive into the what, the why and the how, and some practical steps that pension scheme trustees can take, as well as their covenant advisors, and other advisors around this area. So just very, very quickly, for those who are not, and I should also mention that as part of the session, we will be giving you plenty of opportunity to pose your questions. Please do so in the chat function that should be available to you all, and that will be the second part of this session. So just very quickly about A4S. Accounting for Sustainability was founded by His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales back in 2004, with the remit to ensure that we don't address the 21st century challenges with 20th century processes and methods. Our purpose is to transform finance to deliver a sustainable future, and we work across the entire finance and accounting community, both at a very senior level and also at a very practitioner level, with workshops, webinars, guidance, events, and we also run an academy on this. And then specifically with pensions, we run an asset owners network, which is for pension fund chairs to come together in a confidential space to share and learn from each other. And we have our ESG toolkit for pension chairs and trustees, which is something which we provide for those trustees to really gain knowledge and confidence and understand peer-to-peer examples around different elements of embedding ESG into the investment and strategic decisions that they make. Okay, so just quickly as a bit of context, what are ESG risks and opportunities, and why consider as part of the employee covenant process? So apologies if this is something which is you're very au fait with, but just to ensure that everyone is on the same page on this, ESG related risks refer to risks arising from environmental, social, or governance factors. And these risks, the reason we're bringing these in is these risks may impact an employer's ability to support the pension scheme financially in a number of ways. So on the environmental, the physical risks from climate change, for example, around extreme weather, natural disasters, climate action failure. Then there's also the very real risk of transition risk caused by moving to a net zero economy. There are nature-related risks, for example, biodiversity loss, pollution, water scarcity, and also there is the potential of litigation risk, which we have seen in the media over the past few years. Then on social, there's changing demographics, there's inequality, which could include forced labour, and there's consumer preferences, as just some of those examples. And then around the governance, which is an element where people are much more au fait with, and it's been embedded into people's practices for a lot longer. The sponsor risk management processes is a governance risk, board composition, to name just a few, as well as the litigation element I mentioned. And then on opportunities, we mustn't forget that as well as risks to consider, there is also how different elements of environmental, social and governance can provide opportunities that can make a difference to the sponsor of the pension that you're looking at. So for example, ESG related, for example, the blue economy practices, which could yield new sources of clean energy, natural cooling systems in ocean-based industries. It can generate new jobs and inclusive clean growth. So that's a very specific example of an opportunity. And then around why consider these risks and opportunities into the employee covenant process. Trustees, the the advisors, and all across the investment chain are increasingly cognizant of the link between their ESG risk management and the financial performance of their investments. And this is also gaining further traction, especially in the UK with recent TCFD regulation, really bringing this to the forefront. ESG related risk can threaten an employer's ability to provide financial support to a scheme with downside scenarios such as the impact of climate change, etc., as mentioned earlier, having an adverse effect on the sponsor. And then this therefore can affect the strength of the sponsor's covenant over time, and in particular for the time horizon over which a sponsor might be needed to support the scheme. Another element is obviously regulatory guidance and changes, and this is a key consideration in the evolving landscape of compliance. So in the UK, regulators are increasing their advice to the pension industry on considering ESG risks and opportunities within their investment and strategic decisions, and we will see further guidance from the TPR in 2022, so later on this summer, I believe, to cover the impact of ESG risk in this process. So that's just a very kind of quick snapshot. We go into much more detail on this in the guidance that we've launched today, and we will signpost you all to that afterwards. But without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Karina to talk very much through those top tips around how you would embed the how bit, how you would embed ESG risks and opportunities into the employee covenant process.
Thank you, Kerry, and good morning, everybody. So yes, as Kerry said, the part I was going to talk to on this webinar is the sort of how we actually see this evolving. And before I go into the detail of the 6 top tips we've identified, I'll just talk about how we put them together. So, I mean, this was very much intended to be, I suppose, a practical guide. So for trustees and practitioners to create a route map through this sort of new process of looking at ESG risk within sponsor covenant evaluation. It is very much a balance, I think, when we've put these top tips together, a balance between, trustees being able to undertake this work themselves, trustees working with their advisors. So a balance between what trustees can do and perhaps what they might want to call on advisor support for. It's also very much a balance between trustees and sponsors. And we talk a lot about interaction and engagement. And this is really something I see where trustees and sponsors can work together. And then finally, I think it's a balance between a sort of, I suppose, analysis and assessment, and I suppose quite a technical piece with very much also a focus on engagement. So there's that, again, that balance between actually doing some sort of detailed consideration and analysis, but balancing that with real practical engagement across the process. The other thing I wanted to say, I guess, is that it's very much an evolving process. We're all very much at the start or near the start of this journey of assessing ESG risk. And so there will be lessons learned as we go through these processes. But this, I think, is intended to start you off. And I think very much, it's very much like integrated risk management, and that is an evolving and dynamic process. And I would see this sort of ESG engagement as an evolving process as well, whereby you're continually assessing whether these risks are evolving, changing, needing different risks and needing to be monitored. And in the guide that we process, we do show the sort of 6 stages as a bit of a circle and a loop, and a sort of which shows that you would intend to go back to the start. Okay, so if we go to the first top tip that we have given, the first top tip is we've put as defining the relevant time horizon. And this is so what do we mean by this? So what we mean is we need to understand the time horizon for the scheme in order to understand the relevant time horizon with which to assess ESG risk. And that's why do we need to do that? And that we need to do that because it's critically important to sort of doing a proportionate amount of work and focusing the work and the time horizon where the covenant or the sponsor covenant is needed to support the scheme. And I think so specifically when we're looking at covenant risk and the types of support that a scheme can need from the covenant, we can look at 2 or 3 different phases of support. And the first phase, which many schemes are still in, is a phase where they need cash support from the company. And in those situations, we need to look at the ESG risks, which could impact the level of the cash available in probably a relatively short-term time horizon. The second phase, which many schemes are moving in towards and into, is a stage where actually they need less cash from the company, but they still do need the sponsor to underwrite downside risk within its own business, but also within the scheme's performance as well. And so there we're looking at sort of financial capacity and financial resilience. And so we're looking at ESG risks, which can severely impact that level of financial resilience. And then the third phase really is a sort of viability phase. Actually, many pension schemes are going to be around for a very long period of time unless they look at one of the other options on the market, and therefore they need the sponsor to remain solvent as they progress through that much longer term time horizon until all the pensioners have been paid. And in that case, you're looking at really a very, very severe risks, which can actually impact the solvency of the employer. So this is just framing the types of support that's needed, and therefore that will give you a sort of time horizon in which to consider the different types of risk and opportunity. So that's the first thing we say, is identify that time horizon. The second thing, thank you, is to really spend a bit of time broadening your understanding, I suppose, of sponsor-related ESG risks and opportunities. And why do we say that? Because what do we mean by that? Well, we mean actually look at the sector that your sponsor is in and the geography that your sponsor is, the market region. And that's because a lot of ESG risks are defined and as a result of the industry in which the sponsor operates and also the regions in which they operate. So we're really saying actually then explore what kinds of ESG risks that the sponsor might be exposed to. And I think you need to go a little deeper here. We've talked before in an ECPA paper, which is published on our website, around going beyond just the sector to deeper to the subsector that your sponsor is involved in. Because actually within a sector, some sponsors may be actually able to benefit from opportunities. Other sponsors might be deeply affected by ESG risk. So actually this is about sort of broadening your understanding and taking the time to do that and understanding where the data comes from and which you might be able to use to support your work. And I think, this will give you, again, I suppose, that sort of that sector lens and also that regional lens. The third stage beyond that is around gathering that relevant data and information. And there's two stages here we've talked about. First of all is that gathering of data. And there's a lot of information available out there, and sometimes that can be a little bit confusing. Why do we say you need to spend a bit of time on this stage of the process? Well, because that allows you to engage better with the sponsor and perhaps challenge information that's provided to you, looking at different data around from different, against the sponsor and their peers might give you a bit of benchmarking as to where your sponsor sits within a range of similar organizations. So the first stage we're saying, first of all, look at what information is out there from your sponsor. Now, sponsors sometimes publish quite a lot of information in their annual reports. They're looking at sustainability risks within their risk disclosures. They might disclose things around net zero targets, around board diversity, around sustainability linked financing. All of this information can start to build you a good picture of the kinds of risks that the sponsor is exposed to. Also, going forward, we will be able to look at TCFD reporting as well for many sponsors, focusing specifically on climate change scenarios. And when you focused in on your sponsor, as I said, you can then broaden out and look at your peers, sponsors' peers, and looking at sustainability ratings, for example, and looking at other information that's disclosed by peers as well. And that will give you, as I say, a broader picture. And within this research phase, we're also including the first stage of engagement with the sponsor. And as I said, this stage, I suppose, this top tip is really, again, about that balance between analysis, assessment, data, and actually engagement and conversation. And I think that's a really important thing to bring out at this stage of the process. Now, you might engage through a workshop. There is actually some guidance on the A4S website called Managing Future Uncertainty, which you might be able to look at to give you a little bit of help to prompt that process. But I think this is, again, this stage with the sponsor is really the research phase, getting them to talk to you about what they see their risks are and how they're planning to manage and mitigate them over time. Again, perhaps talk to them about the publicly available data that you've gathered. Talk to them about how they're rated by the rating third-party assessors such as Sustainalytics or whatever. Perhaps talk about how they're positioning sustainability risk to their investors and other stakeholders. And so I think that's a really important phase. So then you've got a sort of picture of the time horizon. You've got a broad understanding of where your sector risk is, and you've got some more detailed understanding and data then around the specifics related to your sponsor. So at that point, you've built quite a good picture, and you've also had some interaction with management around what they think their risks are and how they're going to manage them. The final point in that, the final point in that is also to consider engaging with your peers. As I talked about at the start, this is very much the start of a journey, and it's a new and evolving area. And actually talking to your peers through different forums, exploring what information is available, looking at case studies, for example, again, the A4S website publishes some of those, joining with collaborative platforms. It's really important to see, I suppose, and assess where you are relative to others. And I think that's sort of the final piece of the research is to really just test your thinking and the data you've gathered with others in a like-minded situation. So I think that's a really positive thing to do. So if we then look, so we've sort of gone through the first three phases, so to move on to stage 4, this is sort of, now you've got those all that data is really the assessment phase. What does that data mean? What does that actually mean in terms of risk to your sponsor and sponsor support? This is where you might want to leverage advice. What we're actually saying in this phase is, you might have in-house skills. You might have trustees with particular skills. You might want to actually talk to advisors with skills around assessing this kind of information. Actually, I was on a webinar quite recently, and one of the top tips that I found from that was that a trustee who commented actually one of the best things they had done was to get somebody from the organization who was the sustainability person with head of sustainability within the organization to become a company nominated trustee, therefore bringing that expertise onto the trustee board. And that was actually a really powerful tool to improve and, I suppose, upskill the trustees themselves and enable them to really engage in this process. So in terms of assessing, there are lots of different ways of assessing. You could use sort of risk sort of traditional ways of assessing risks. So looking at likelihood of the risk occurring, looking at the impact of the risk occurring. You could do some scenario planning and stress testing. And some schemes have already started that process with their TCFD work. Some companies will have done that and will be willing to share. And in the scenario modeling, you're sort of looking, I suppose, at some very key scenarios there, which you think are going to have high likelihood and high impact, or maybe low likelihood and very high impact, and considering those risks and trying to identify their impact. And then I think you can also obviously do more complex modeling. So you can do that at quite a light high level, or you can do that at a sort of more detailed sustainability modeling level, which again, you might need expert support for. And again, TCFD is probably where people have started with that in terms of modeling the impact of climate change. I think it's also, and it's an important point to say here, when you're starting to do this assessment, this is where I suppose all the advisors of the scheme, when I talk about balancing actually the advice from different sets of advisors and expertise, also needs to be brought together. So many people are looking at ESG risk from an investment perspective when they're looking at scheme. That work has probably already started. So it's really important that you bring together the work of your covenant advisor and your investment advisor to look at any areas of correlation of risk, so situations where the sponsor is impacted by ESG risk, but also the investments of the scheme are impacted by ESG risk, because obviously then you have that doubling up of risk and a greater reliance then on the sponsor to support the downside risk in the scheme at a time when it is potentially very stressed. And I think that's really an important process. So to bring together the different types of advice that you're getting. The fifth tip is back to engagement. And again, this part of the process we think is around really, now you've done some analysis, you have a view of the type of impact, the likelihood of that impact, the size of that impact on the sponsor. And really then I think it's a more challenging conversation around how those risks that you've identified that might impact the scheme and the support to the scheme are going to be managed and mitigated by the business. I think it's also an opportunity to share, because the sponsor will not have visibility, the impact of ESG risks on the scheme investments itself, and where those, as we've just talked about, where those risks correlate, because actually that's something the sponsor might not have visibility on, and that might change or influence their thinking on how to manage risk and which risks are particularly material to the scheme. So that's where we talk, really about it being a collaborative process, and really important that dynamic is shared and discussed. And then the final phase of the process, the final tip we have is about review. So measuring, monitoring, and reassessing accordingly. So what does that mean? So what that effectively means putting in place something, once you've done all this work, to actually keep on top of how those risks are emerging, how the mitigation that you've discussed with management is being put in place, and are they actually going to impact the scheme as you progress through those different time horizons. It's really important, some of these risks you've identified might be very, very near term, and a deadline will pass, the company will have managed it appropriately, you can move on, you don't need to keep assessing that risk. Other things will be something which will materialize more slowly. So it might be that it's a continual impact on the bottom line of developing new products, or and perhaps they don't succeed, and then they need to reinvest in more research to develop new products and so on. And that can mean that the business is slow, that sponsor is slowly changing rather than sort of a single event or acute risk emerging. So monitoring them appropriately in an appropriate time frame is really important. And that brings us back to that point around the evolution of your ESG risk assessment and monitoring, and that you can refresh and reframe the process effectively on an appropriate basis, on an appropriate time horizon, to make sure that it continues to be appropriate. So that sort of dynamic evolution of monitoring is really important. So, as Kerry's just noted, we do go into quite a lot more detail into what you might put in each of those phases in the guidance that's just published, but that's to give you a real framework, I guess, as I said at the start, a practical framework for going through this process of putting ESG risk into the covenant assessment process.
Thank you, Karina, and also to thank Karina on behalf of A4S for ECPA, and Karina in particular for helping to develop and create this guide with us. So we're really excited to have been able to launch it today in collaboration with ECPA. So that's great. And I'm going to now ask Paul, who is the head of employee covenant at Railpen, to say a few words and share his experiences at Railpen on this topic, and how and look at the why, what, how, so what they have done and how they have done it, and also look at the challenges that they have faced on that. So over to you, Paul.
Oh, thank you, and good morning, everybody. I was just going to do this session going through what the railway pension scheme is, and how Railpen works with them on lots of different ways, why we view climate risk as part of longevity analysis overall as incredibly important to final salary pension schemes or DB pension schemes, how we in Railpen incorporate this into our covenant analysis, and then going to finish off with what we then do with it and how we interact with the trustee once we've done all our analysis. So to crack on, the Railway Pension Scheme is one of the largest in the UK. It normally ranks about sort of 6th or 7th, but I think by far the most complex of the UK pension arrangements. It was created in '94 on the privatisation of the railways. Effectively came from the old BR pension scheme. Got about 350,000 members. Assets, pension assets of about £35–36 billion. And we've got about 150 sponsoring employers from all different sectors of the railway industry. Whilst it's one scheme, it is sectionalised. So there are 107 different sections of the RPS. Each of these sections is effectively its own pension scheme, does its own valuation, has its own balance sheet, sets its own contributions, and to a large degree its own rules as well. So effectively we're looking after 107 different pension schemes within the RPS. Now, there's one trustee, single trustee, corporate trustee board, RPTCL, and Railpen is a wholly owned subsidiary of the corporate trustee, and Railpen provides all the executive functions for the RPS: pensions admin, the communications, the governance, fiduciary, which the covenant team is part of, and acts as the investment manager for all the RPS investments. It's that link with the investment side where I think everybody appreciates that the investment sector was really ahead of the curve on climate analysis, and covenant is to a large degree catching up, but I think we're catching up fast, and I'll touch on that as well. The RPS is particularly complex because of a number of factors: that sectionalised nature, but also because it came from public sector. Some members who were working in the railways in '94 have a legal right to maintain their membership of the RPS. So an employer can't just choose to close its section of the RPS. There's also a complete range of types of sections or schemes within the RPS, from ones that are completely open to new members and future accrual. So these are incredibly healthy, ongoing pension schemes that are very immature and have a stable membership, stable maturity level, all the way through to ones that are closing or are closed, or indeed might have closed pretty much at privatisation and are now very far down the route to significant maturity. And some have now gone through full buy-ins and buyouts. So the full spectrum of of what you can see in the UK railways sort of in the UK pensions environment you see within the RPS itself. Because of that complexity, the trustee at Swism decided to set up an in-house covenant team back in 2010, and that's, I think, bore fruit because of the sort of cross-fertilisation within the railway industry. All these employers are to some degree involved in railways, and we can set that up, use that sort of cross-fertilisation, as well as build up a really good relationship with the trustee and with the other teams and people within Railpen to give a really good service to the trustee. Now the covenant team provides improvement, protection and monitoring of covenant strength in order to protect the security of RPS members' benefits, and that's what we are fully defined on. Everything is about protecting the security of benefits, and because we've got such a wide range of different types of sections, particularly those that are still open, we could get a new member coming into an RPS section today, and the trustee will still expect to be paying that person's pension in 2080, 2090, maybe even the year 2100. So we've got to take a very long-term look at how a sponsor is likely to be able to continue to support those schemes. A growing element within covenant in general is covenant longevity, not just looking at the strength of the employer just now, but what do we think it will look like in the next sort of 5 years, 10 years, or much further out than that. And climate change clearly comes into that longevity outlook. It feeds into our understanding of how an employer is likely to still be there. How much can we rely on that employer, and how quickly, particularly if they are a maturing section, how quickly would we want to see a real sort of low level of investment risk taken with that section, and how quickly might we even want to see that go all the way through to buyout. The climate change, as it impacts on longevity, is an important consideration, and we look at it really in sort of three ways. We look at it from a sector perspective, we look at it from a management and employer governance perspective, and we also look at the employer specific details. And we work together with our own Railpen Sustainable Ownership team to use a lot of their tools and techniques that they've developed primarily for the asset owning side, but we can also apply those to the covenant side as well. So that's really what we are. Why do we look at climate, and why do we look at longevity? Well, everything I said is to make sure that members get their pensions, and climate change is becoming more apparent as a major systemic risk. We recognise the importance of incorporating it into our employer covenant approach, and looking at climate risk and climate opportunity, particularly within the railways, where railways is already pretty much acknowledged as the greenest form of mass transport. So climate change brings opportunity for a number of the employers in the railway pension scheme, and that's very much aligned with the overall trustees' fiduciary duty and trying to pay all the pensions on time and in full. The climate risk is often defined as both physical risk and transition risk, and that's very applicable to the railways. Railways rely on assets, including some very long-term assets. The railways uses tracks and bridges that were built by Brunel in the 19th century. The rolling stock that it uses typically lasts 20 to 40 years plus. So long-term assets, but it's also a very highly regulated industry. Health and safety are critical matters for railways. So that regulation means it's also quite vulnerable to transition risk as well as physical risk. And the physical risk for a number of schemes and sectors can be something that we're guessing what it looks like, but on the railways, the adverse weather conditions and more volatile weather conditions are already biting, and the resilience of the railway infrastructure is an important element now, particularly for Network Rail, the dominant infrastructure provider for UK railways. And we've seen, as I say, both physical and transition risk already biting on the railways. So these are real, they're not just forward-looking. Beyond this, we're also looking at how well our employers are planning or are on their way to managing that transition to net zero, and also looking from a wider perspective, on a sort of integrated finance perspective, that transition risk also poses a systemic risk to the financial system as a whole. And if there was weakness there or stress there, that is likely to create funding gaps. And given that Covenant is in the context of the pension obligations they're supporting, then a wider funding gap would, all else being equal, lead to a weakening of the employer covenant. So we take account not just of the pure employer side of this, but also the employer's ability to deal with wider systemic risks that could arise from climate risk as a whole. If I move then on to how we do this, the Covenant team sits within what we call our fiduciary business unit, and that unit acts as an internal client representing the trustee and effectively representing the members. Given the Covenant team is part of that unit, it means that we can sit alongside the other teams there, our sustainable ownership team, but also our client investment team, our investment strategy teams, our internal pension policy and actuarial teams, so that we can work really integrated with those on a day-to-day basis and provide an integrated approach to the financial and sustainability outcomes that are going to be for the benefit of our members. And that's really how we're there to support the trustee to meet its fiduciary duty. Working with our sustainable ownership team in particular has provided big dividends. They are at the forefront of sustainable ownership reporting and monitoring, and working with various government teams and the regulator to define what reporting should be like. We can draw on their practices and tools and the gradings that they initially developed for the investment side of the Railpen business, and use that to apply and help us with our Covenant elements. Now, we can also use them, and they use us as well, to stay informed on the team's research about what's happening in the rail industry, on policy statements and decisions that come from both the Department for Transport and other government departments. And that helps us monitor factors that could impact on Covenant strength going forward. But continuing on the how, as I said, we look at climate risk as part of our longevity analysis for Covenant longevity. That is a highly complex area on its own, but we've split it into three simple parts. We look at longevity from a sector perspective, management and governance perspective, and then looking at how it impacts on the employer-specific elements themselves. On the sector view, our sponsoring employers are all involved in the railway industry to some degree, but there are various parts in there. There's the infrastructure like Network Rail, but you've also got the train operating companies, the train builders, the rolling stock companies, freight operators, and then wider, not just on railways, but we've got some huge construction companies and engineering and consultancy businesses, IT companies and service companies. All of these sectors have got different characteristics, and each one of them are going to have different touch points with climate risks, with transition and physical risks, and we need to understand what those different risks that they are that they're likely to face. So for each of these, we look at the current position and the long-term outlooks for that sector, but not just as it affects their employers, but also as it affects their main suppliers and their main customers. Things that we've seen already biting is where it's been either a supplier or a customer that has faced a risk. So it has to be a wide view that we take when we're looking at these sectors. Now, to understand the nature of transition risk and how it's going to affect these sectors, again, we work with our sustainable ownership team, looking at the regulations, and we work quite closely with Network Rail. Network Rail have got a big team that are looking at climate risk. They were one of the first, I think the first railway company in the world to bring out a science-based target for net zero alignment. So they have a lot of initiatives on their own and are very much setting the pace for net zero alignment for the UK rail industry. Even further than that, they've actually defined a sort of hurdle for their suppliers, that they need all 75% of their suppliers have got to define and carry out their own science-based targets for meeting net zero if they want to continue to be suppliers to Network Rail. So that's I think works with the green elements of the railway industry as a whole, but also enables us to work on a sort of joined up basis with a number of our employers, because everybody's working towards the same thing. On the governance side, we're looking at the board's oversight of all different risks and opportunities, including climate-related risk, and also looking at his role in assessing and managing those risks. Again, from the investment side, we've seen for a while that strong governance promotes and enables good long-term risk-adjusted investments from an investment perspective. But from the governance side, it also gives us the confidence that the sponsoring employer recognises and manages the risks and opportunities it faces. So insight into governance is crucial for our understanding of the longevity aspects and longevity strength of the employer covenant, particularly where it's got a lot of interaction with government and the public sector, which a number of our employers do. Then we build in the longevity side to our employer-specific covenant analysis as well. We're all, I think, well used now to the typical sort of traditional covenant monitoring and analysis work that goes on with balance sheets and cash flows and forecasts and that kind of thing. But we're now adding in a more holistic view to take account of the climate risk that employers are facing as well. Have they identified what the physical or transition risks that they are facing? Have they created a plan to see how they get from where they are now to what they're doing? Have they joined in with the Network Rail scheme to set their science-based targets, and can we work with them on that? And particularly, again, we use one of the tools created by Railpen Sustainable Ownership team called the Crianza tool, which is Climate Risk Analysis and Net Zero Alignment. And this is just a sort of methodical process we can go through to rate where companies are along their process towards net zero alignment. And it gives us the ability to make that rating, but it also, because we're using the same tool as Railpen uses for its investment side, it can give a parity of usability to the trustee when the trustee is considering climate risk across assets, liabilities, and covenant risks. Once we have did all this, I'll just finish off by saying, how do we use this information? And this to me is one of the critical points, is how we report. We are advisors to the trustees. We don't make any decisions ourselves. But that climate risk analysis as part of longevity is a really important part of our overall covenant strength advice. Once we've completed it, we present it in a way that is understandable and usable by the trustee. Now, we've worked with the trustee for over 12 years now, and over that period, I think we have a good idea from the trustee what it expects and needs from us to make its decisions. Employer covenant information as a whole is very complex. Climate risk analysis and longevity is very complex. So we aim to make sure that our findings and advice are presented to the trustee in a language and a format that the trustee can easily use in its decision-making process. Our standard reports are all done on a section-by-section, scheme-by-scheme basis. So we try to get a uniformity of how we present to the trustee, so the trustee knows where it should look at any point in time for different bits of information, and keep it to a really simple rating system. So we might lose some of the subtleties or sort of fancy bits of the analysis, but if we can get our main advice over in a way that's usable, we find that incredibly useful and get really good feedback from the trustee. Just looking a wee bit forward, we're now embedding these climate risk and opportunity analysis into everything that we do on covenant, building it in with our other ESG factors for our upcoming triennial valuation process that we're kicking off just now. And we look forward to working with our employers and Network Rail, and no doubt government departments as we go through that process.
Thank you, Paul. And this is to provide everyone an opportunity, and conscious that we have slightly run over, but if anyone has, and I've got a couple of questions if no one has any burning questions they want to ask now, but please do add anything to the chat. And I see that we have one already. So I think I'll start with my question while we digest some of the ones coming through. So back to you, Karina. I wonder if you can give a sense on, are you seeing many companies engage with their pension schemes on this in a meaningful way? Do you feel that companies are getting that ESG is requiring a fundamental business, is part of a fundamental business transition, or do you still think there's a way to go on that?
Oh, that's a detailed question, Kerry, and I think there are a number of different answers to that. So are we seeing engagement? Yes, but I think it's early days. I think there can be more engagement, most definitely. You know, where we see and I sort of pick up Mike's question in the chat here, where we're starting obviously on an ESG perspective, where most people are starting their work for the larger schemes particularly is through TCFD. And so there is engagement in that process, but we are at an early stage in it. So are there immediate examples that we can quote now as to that process having been gone through in a thoroughly engaged way and having gone to the end of that process now and sort of, I suppose, impacted what decision making that trustees have already taken? I would say that process is in train. So we will see some of those things, and I do believe we will, but I think that is further down the line. I think in terms of do people see it as important and do sponsors see it as important? I think people are increasingly having to see this as important, and that we're seeing that from all different angles. Particularly if you're a business, what we are seeing is increasingly that financing for your business is likely to have some form of sustainability target within it, which might affect the pricing of the debt. So when that starts to bite, people are clearly very, very interested and motivated to look at ESG risk. So I think we will just see that just increase, that level of engagement, that level of in the topic just increase.
And then to elaborate on that with Mike's question on examples of how climate change has actually impacted on those funding targets, and then endgame planning and covenant support that he's mentioned there. Have you got any other examples that you can include there?
So I haven't got examples specifically of, as I say, of having reached the end of that process. So very much the schemes that I'm working with, and I know some of my peers are working with, are in that process right now. So having that engagement, understanding that ESG risk, understanding if it's significant now or if it's significant over a period of time. What I would say is a lot of the energy transition risks or opportunities that we're looking at are genuinely over a longer period of time than an immediate impact. So what we are seeing, and the debates that we're having with trustees and boards, is that energy transition risk is maybe a 10-year time horizon, and within that, with some sponsors that we're working with, there are opportunities, or there are opportunities for management to mitigate the risk. So that doesn't necessarily mean an immediate impact on a funding target, for example, particularly a sort of near-term cash-driven funding target. What it is doing is framing some of the conversations over the time horizons for reaching a longer-term funding target. And I would say that absolutely is happening, and I am seeing those conversations. So if we can see that, you know, there's a net zero target in place by a certain date, what does that mean for the time horizon that the scheme might be looking to reduce its reliance on a sponsor?
Okay, thank you, Karina. And then Paul, we've had a question from Ryan on what guides you on how to vary the level of detail of analysis when you're for the differing sizes of the Railpen sections.
I think nothing really more specific than the the overall mantra of risk-based and proportionate. So we have some phenomenally large sections. We've got some sections that have got sort of single-digit number of members in it. So we vary compared to the size of the section, the number of members that are there, but also the complexity of the employer, the strength of that employer, and the different sort of issues that the different sectors or different employers are facing at that point. So risk-based and proportionate is the overall methodology. Now, I would add though that within the railway industry, it has continued to receive significant funding all the way from credit crunch onwards, and has therefore been quite a very sort of fertile ground for M&A activity. So we've had a huge amount of transactions or potential type A events, as we call them in the covenant world, to make sure there's no material detriment that you go through a transaction. So that gets a really concentrated burst of activity on covenant whenever these transactions happen, and a significant number of our employers have gone through those.
And on that note, Paul, and you have referred to this in your presentation earlier, but bearing in mind that Railpen has some, very unique elements, which means, the challenges and the parameters that you deal with can be are slightly different to other schemes. What would you say as kind of like a takeaway from this are some of the practical actions and top tips that can be transferable to other pension schemes that you would say now trustees or advisors you should be doing now?
I think two main ones. One is that because we've got one trustee that looks after 107 schemes. So when you get trustee meetings, we have an integrated funding committee that deals with funding, investment strategy, covenant and contributions, etc. We've got to be really joined up with the other parts of that integrated funding analysis to present to the trustee so that they can get a proper. So this is a lot of preparation. We're working with the actuaries, we're working with the investment people to make sure that an investment and funding strategy is compatible with the covenant strength and the longevity outlook for that employer. So that's the first part, is working with the other advisors before you get in front of the trustee so that you can present a full picture and a very joined up picture. The second one is the simplicity of the message and the simplicity of the advice that we give to the trustee. A lot of our analysis, like every other advisor that advises a trustee, a lot of the stuff is really complex, and we get no prizes for making it look really complex. We get plaudits when we make it usable advice, and advice that the trustee can take action on. So we try to distill everything down. As I say, we might lose some of the subtleties, but if the message is really clear and understandable, and the trustee is not focusing on how we've arrived at that, but focusing on what they should do with that advice and how that can add to their decision-making process, then that's probably my main one. It's that not doing the work, but how you present it to the trustee in a usable and actionable way.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And we do mention that both on the case study that we did with you, Paul, and also the guide. And then an interesting question here is on when we talk about the likelihood versus the impact of climate scenarios, not versus. Question for either of you, how do you assess the likelihood? How do you go about that?
It's a really good challenge. Paul, do you want to know?
X, Y, Z, isn't it?
So I can see Michael has put something here in sense that some of those comments, there's external data sources, whether it's the Bank of England or whether it's other sources that might be commenting on specific things like climate risk or temperature rise and so on. But I think it is generally to the point of, part of that research phase that I talked about, particularly when you're engaging with the sponsor, is be talking to them about how they think those risks are emerging and how they will impact their business over time. So not those macro risks, probably that's probably external data sources, but some of those sponsor specific risks, it'll be about the engagement and the questioning. Paul, I don't know if you want to add there.
Well, from my side, so both physical and transition risk have already bitten inside the railway industry. The climate resilience of infrastructure is there, and our employers like Network Rail, who is owner and responsible for that infrastructure, this is a massive issue for them, and they're having to do a lot of work. Now, in one way, it's lucky that everything that happens on the railways is paid for by one of two people. It's either the taxpayer or the fare payer. So a lot of the things that Network Rail have to do are effectively funded by government, and government do see the railways as the sort of backbone of its green transportation system. So it's sitting in a good position there, but that physical risk is already biting. On the transition risk, we've seen that as well. Back in 2015, the carbon tax doubled on coal. Coal was the biggest single commodity that used to be moved by the rail freight companies, and overnight their turnover dropped by about half. Now that is a fantastic sort of manifestation of transition risk. That can happen, and that did bite, and it makes it very real for us when we're looking at where are these risks going to happen. The transition risks are real. They will happen not because of what happens in the skies and temperature and things like that, but whether governments and industries decide to impose things. And Network Rail has imposed this rule that 75% of its employers must set these science-based targets for net zero alignment. So that's a very real transition risk that all of our employers have. Are they going to meet that hurdle that Network Rail have, or are they going to lose one of their biggest customers? So a lot of this is very real. We look to our investment and SO colleagues when we're looking at the wider stress testing and looking at the bigger sort of systemic risk and impact of climate and different changes. But we've got enough to do on the real stuff we can touch on covering it with our employers.
Okay, thank you both very much. And just before we wrap